We begin in Hong Kong this morning with the latest on the deepening crisis over those anti-government protests. This is a story grabbing international attention. The global focus sharpened after 2 days of violence and turmoil grounded flights at the city's main airport. On the heels of those scenes, authorities have now announced a number of arrests and an interim injunction to stop any further threat to airport operations. Beijing has also issued a blunt statement saying the latest demonstrations border on an act of terrorism.
Oh my God. Oh no.
This was the chaotic and violent scene yesterday. Protesters clashed with riot police, forcing the cancellation of hundreds of flights. This story continues to develop, and we have all the angles covered for you this morning. Now, look at this. This is a live look at Hong Kong Airport this hour at 6 p.m. Protesters are staging another sit-in, but it's relatively calm compared to previous days. A much different scene. So let's start on the ground in Hong Kong. We're joined now by freelance reporter Justin Solomon, who is at the city's international airport. Justin, tell us what you're seeing right now.
Well, the airport is back in operation, as you said, but with delays as the airport struggles to make up for all of those canceled flights. Now, if you go up to the departure level, it's a wild scene. You would have no idea of the chaos that ensued last night. All of the posters are gone, all of the graffiti completely covered up. Now, protesters, of course, have apologized for what they've done. They've issued a letter to folks of Hong Kong and travelers, and even issued these posters that they're handing out that say, sorry, our sincere apology, where it goes on to say, we're helpless, but we won't give up. So the protesters are still here behind me, as you can see. And I know you mentioned that injunction. Well, the airport is still allowing protesters to stay here, but in 2 designated protest zones, like the one behind me. And there are a few hundred here still greeting passengers as they arrive. Another big change at Hong Kong Airport, security. You must now show your ticket and passport or ID before you're allowed into the check-in area. Before you can even leave your baggage, you need to show them that you are traveling. That, of course, to keep the protesters at bay. Back to you.
What would you tell then a passenger who is about to fly in or fly out of Hong Kong?
I'd say check ahead, and the airport is saying the same thing. You must check with your airline and the airport to make sure your flight is on time or even taking off. There have been about 2 dozen cancellations today as the airport continues to make up for all of these canceled flights.
Justin Solomon, thank you. Justin Solomon is a freelance reporter with us this morning from Hong Kong. Now let's go to London for more on this story. Rene Philiponius is tracking the latest response from authorities in Hong Kong and also the reaction from Beijing. Rene, Hong Kong police have held a news conference about what happened yesterday. What did they say?
Absolutely. We saw a lot of those images from last night, those violent clashes between police and the protesters. We saw a situation where one of the protesters sort of attacked a police officer with his baton. A gun was drawn. It was a very tense situation. And police are placing the blame for what happened yesterday squarely on the protesters and are making a pledge to the people of Hong Kong that the people involved will be brought to justice. Now, police say that over the years, they've always supported and facilitated peaceful protests, but what is going on now has crossed a line and should be severely condemned. Have a listen.
What began as a sit-in protest gradually became confrontational and violent as protesters unlawfully blocked departure gates and prevented passengers boarding their planes. Then it quickly escalated to intense violence, with some innocent visitors being intimidated, humiliated, and unlawfully detained by some radical protesters.
Now, Janet, a major demand from protesters has been an investigation into police violence. Over the weekend, there was those images of police using tear gas, batons, even rubber bullets in a crowded subway system. And supporters of the protesters say that action is why things are escalating, that it's a vicious cycle with violence from the police spurring violence from the protesters. So international organizations and governments are also joining those calls for an investigation, but nothing like that has been announced.
What are we hearing from China?
Well, China has condemned the protests, which they refer to as riots verging on terrorism. And a statement from the Chinese liaison office in Hong Kong says demonstrators took off the so-called mask of peaceful, reasonable and non-violent protests to paralyze the airport. Now, we heard reports yesterday that Beijing had moved military personnel to the Hong Kong border. Well, today we are seeing these satellite images that show military vehicles inside a sports center in Shenzhen, which is just across the harbor from Hong Kong, and it's fueling speculation that they may be ready to intervene and put an end to the protests. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump was asked about the situation. Here's what he had to say.
It's a very tricky situation. I think it'll work out, and I hope it works out for liberty. I hope it works out for everybody, including China. I hope it works out peacefully. Hope nobody gets hurt. I hope nobody gets killed.
At this point, neither side is willing to budge on their demands. The protesters may be taking a break from the airport. And, they're still there today, but it's a much different scene than yesterday. But their fight for greater autonomy from China is far from over, and there are no signs that Hong Kong leaders or China are willing to budge.
Thank you, Rene. CBC's Rene Philiponius reporting from London today. Much calmer scenes at Hong Kong's international airport today as operations return to near normal. 2 days of violent protests grounded hundreds of flights. Police made several arrests for unlawful assembly, assault, and possession of weapons. Despite authorities obtaining an interim injunction, some demonstrators remain at the terminal this morning in a special area sectioned off. For more on this, we've reached Emily Lau. She is the former chair of the Hong Kong Democratic Party and a former member of the Legislative Council, joining us now from Hong Kong. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, Janet. Thank you.
We're hearing today of an apology the protesters have issued to the people of Hong Kong for the 2 days of shutting down the airport. Did they go too far in shutting the airport down?
Well, I think they did, and so do many Hong Kong people. We support peaceful protests, and for a few days they attracted a lot of international attention. The tourists were happy to see them, but what happened yesterday had crossed the line, and we hope it will never happen again.
What are you hearing from the people of Hong Kong about the protesters? Do they still support them?
Well, I think the people still want the government of Carrie Lam to come out and accept our demand, which is to withdraw the extradition bill completely and to set up an independent commission of inquiry. So those things we still support, but we don't want any chaotic scenes at the airport anymore.
Well, we have seen the independent inquiry you would like is into the police violence that we've seen through these weeks of protests. We're also seeing some violence on the side of the protesters. They are violently reacting as well. How do you explain that? How do you support it?
No, I think the independent commission of inquiry that the Hong Kong people want is a comprehensive inquiry, not just targeting the police. Don't get us wrong. It's looking at everything. How did the thing start? Why Carrie Lam made such a big blunder? So it's on everything, not just on the police.
So not just the police, not just the extradition bill that started this. What other things are you concerned about?
Well, it's how did Carrie Lam come to make such a big mistake? She admitted several times. She said it was a complete failure. And because of her failure, Hong Kong is paying this heavy price. So we all want to find out. And then, of course, look at the police brutality. And as you said, some of the protesters were wrong in throwing bricks. So the whole inquiry should look at that and recommend ways of reconciliation. How can now a city which is split asunder, how do we come back together again?
But this has moved so far beyond just Carrie Lam and just that extradition bill. The protests have grown, the violence has grown. This is more about the future of the city than it is about Carrie Lam. What will it take to get the protesters off the streets to make them happy?
I think for a start, if we can have this commission of inquiry, not everybody would withdraw, yes, but I think many will be satisfied and wait to see how it proceeds. But of course, you're right. The young people are so agitated because it's their future. We still have 20-odd years until 2047. That's the 50 years of one country, two systems that China promised. And the young people feel very, very worried that we are going to lose our freedoms, lose our personal safety. So I hope the world can understand why they are so concerned.
China is calling these acts, the protests in Hong Kong, near terrorist acts. How concerned are you about that wording and about the buildup of military forces that we're seeing just across the harbor from Hong Kong?
Well, of course, I think for those of you hardened journalists, you know what terrorist acts are. I don't think anybody looking at what happened yesterday or in the last few weeks would describe that as acts of terrorism. I think China has overreacted. And of course, we are calling on Beijing not to do anything foolish, like moving more troops across the boundary into Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong, my dear. This is not Tiananmen Square. And if they should make a fatal mistake, it would be the end of one country, two systems, and it would hurt China too. China needs Hong Kong.
We heard earlier in the program this morning from a Canadian who is from Hong Kong saying he's hearing from family and friends back home who are asking questions about how do I get to move to Canada? What's your response to that?
Well, of course, we hope Canada, and as we speak, you know, there are 300,000 Canadian citizens living and working in Hong Kong, and there are countless Canadian companies here. So, and if Canada would, like to accept more people from Hong Kong, that would be great. But the responsibility lies with Britain. We are a former British colony. We are not a former Canadian colony. But if Canadians love us, I think that's great. But Britain should also make sure they will help the Hong Kong people to feel safe and secure.
What can we do to help without having everyone move from Hong Kong? Obviously, you don't want people leaving Hong Kong. You want safety on the streets. What can we do as other countries?
Absolutely. Well, I think your Prime Minister has already spoken, and I hope he will speak again, to call on China to remain calm and not to do anything foolish. And our concerns, what are our concerns? That we will lose our freedom. We will lose our personal safety and the rule of law. And if we are assured that all those things will be okay, at one country, two systems, there may be lawlessness in mainland China, but Hong Kong people can enjoy our free lifestyle. If that's the case, I don't think too many people will want to leave.
Emily Lau, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.